Hey guys, welcome back to the fanfic reread project. In this episode, we will be continuing our reread of The Dark Knight Rises. I did a count yesterday, and including the epilogue, we only have like 6 chapters left. Unfortunately, the chapters in this are so damn long, I do not know if this will actually be the last episode, and if it is, it's going to be very long, but let's jump right into it with a John chapter. Gordon had them up at Ackerman Park, just like they said they would have. What? Gordon had them up at Ackerman Park, just like they said they would have been before. Okay, so this, we immediately need to stop and talk about this. This is a thing that's actually quite common in this story, as you will have seen by this point. Multiple times, chapters or like a paragraph will open with, this person was here just like someone or someone else said they would be. And I don't understand why I did this, because if someone else said it, why do we constantly need to remind the audience that someone else did this? In that John chapter where she stormed into the house and was like, "Where's Barsad?" Selena's like, "Oh, he's in the living room." And then like literally 2 paragraphs, or not even like a paragraph later, she's like, "He was right where she said he was." And it's like, we know, we just read that. And I understand, at least in this instance, they talked about being at Ackerman Park kind of a long time ago. I think it was in the John chapter when the special forces officers came or something like that. So that was a little while ago. So I understand like reminding people of that, but the moment the people I think would see Ackerman Park, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, I remember they mentioned that," instead of being like, "We were here just like we said we would be. Remember?" And it's like, okay. But anyway, let's let's try to get through this. It was quieter than she thought it would be, considering what just happened. The rubble-covered entrance was completely barren, but there were 2 mercenaries up near the manhole, up on the ledge above them. Writing. John took them out with ease. She crouched down and moved the cover. "Hey, what are you doing?" someone whispered up at her. The only thing she could see was his eyes, watery and pale in the dim light. "We're getting you out of here." She and Rose reached down for him at the same time, taking him by both arms. When they pulled him out, she saw that he was pale and gaunt. Gunshots rang through the air, and the man fell to the ground, his sad frame covered in holes. They looked up to find mercenaries on all sides. They forced them to their feet and pushed them to the precipice overhanging the tunnel. "Who are you?" one of them asked. Neither of them answered. She felt someone shove into her back, and she tumbled over the edge, landing painfully at the foot of the rubble. When she looked up, the mercenaries were coming down towards her, dragging Rose along with them. John tried to get to her feet, but one of them grabbed her by the back of the shirt and dragged her forward. "Take your fucking hands off me," she spat at him. He forced her to her knees. There were 6 of them, a bit of overkill if she was honest, since they had guns, but it looked like they weren't taking chances anymore. There was nothing but tense silence between them, and when the one in front of her cocked his gun, it echoed off the concrete. Okay, so right away, this writing is absolute fucking trash. Number 2, that F-bomb. Like, we're starting to get to the point in the story where the F-bombs really are starting to feel less natural and more just like I was throwing them in there to be edgy. Again, I always have to remind myself that, relatively speaking, I was pretty young, and this is very early on in my writing career, so this kind of stuff was like, ooh, spicy to me. There are a lot of interesting things that I did in my earlier stories that I constantly have to remind myself, like, yeah, I was still pretty early on in this, so I was trying to get a lot of stuff, like, out and see what I could do. And this definitely has that feeling. I think I said, like, back at the beginning of this, I was like, we'll see how this whole thing with the F-bombs goes. And it swings back and forth. Like, some of the stuff in the earlier story, and I think that's because that stuff was edited, it didn't feel as egregious. Once we get into the unedited parts, now it's starting to feel like I'm just throwing them, like, tossing them in like fucking frisbees. A shadow fell from above them and pulled one of the mercenaries from his feet. Rose took the lead then, grabbing the guy in front of them by his arm and knocking the gun from his hands before punching him in the face. Between the 3 of them, they had them out in a few minutes. When they finished, it was quiet again, their footsteps echoing now. Hi, why doesn't John's moves get, like, talked about there? Anyway, you missed the spot, Rose said to him. She noticed one of the guys on the ground inching himself toward him. Batman kicked him in the head. Okay, now this is confusing because we know that the Shadow is Batman, but if you want to have his name said in the text, you, like, this is kind of a general rule. Like, if you're going to do the whole pronoun game thing, say the person's name first and then go into the pronouns. So, you missed a spot, Rose said to the Batman, literally, and then we would have known who the fuck was being, like, talked about here, because again, like, while you do know it's the Batman, the fact that his name hasn't been said is kind of like, okay. The other thing is, I don't understand why Rose has that line when John had it in the original thing. I know I wanted Rose to like say some things, but I could have given her something else to say, especially because the whole point of that line in this version in particular is that it's supposed to be an echo back to something Gordon said in Batman Begins. It doesn't really make sense for Rose, who doesn't have as much of a relationship with Gordon as John, to say that and make that echo. So I feel like I kind of flubbed that, but whatever. It's been a while, John said as he moved toward them. There was something about him that gave her a chill. She guessed it was the eyes. The bright yellow-green irises were practically glowing. Barsad was righter than he knew. He pulled something from his belt and put a small ball in her hands covered in blunt silver spikes. The little thing was beeping. "Count to 5 and throw," he growled. He turned and headed for the end of the ramp. She did like he said, but the little explosion barely moved the rubble. She and Rose looked at each other. "No offense," Rose said to the empty space behind them, "but you got anything bigger in that belt?" There you go. That's another John line. And that's one I don't mind giving away because it's not like significant or anything. And she has another line later down. Like, she could have just, I think this is kind of the issue, is that, and this is very understandable, but sometimes when you go into writing a story and you have multiple characters in a scene, you think that every character has to say something, but that's not entirely true. But it makes sense because you would think, well, if this character's here and they're not talking, then why are they there? You know? But in real life, if you really think about it, not everyone jumps into a conversation that a group is having. Some people are just there listening, you know? This is something that actually came up earlier in this story too. If you remember that John chapter where Barsad explained all the shit, and every character has a chance to be like, well, what about this? And everyone asks a question. That's kind of why that happens, because all the people are there. No one just sits there and like listens and then says like one thing. Everyone has like a question and then a question and a question or a comment or something. And you don't need to do that, because especially in that, it makes the scene way too long. But here it's just like Rose is literally just stealing lines from John that that character had in the movie. There was a roar as that thing he was flying around before slid into view. That thing he was flying around before, his ship. Just say his plane, his ship, whatever. John grabbed Rose by the arm and pulled her to the wall. He fired the cannons, blasting the rubble from the entrance. After the smoke cleared, the cops started to climb from the hole. They were ragged and thin, but they had guns, and they looked happy as hell to be outside. A few of them gasped as the Batman appeared around them. Why is he, or how does he appear around? What is he, Loki? "Oh, what now?" John asked him. "All out assault on Bane." "How?" Rose asked. "He's gonna see us coming." Batman tilted his head to the side. "He's got people who can see us. Like, see us." He shook his head like he understood. Well, if he shakes his head, how does he understand? He nodded. But John was a bit stuck. She'd seen someone do that before, and he was not wearing a bat suit. "Do you know if we can work around it?" he asked them. "Us? No," John finally said, "but he can't see you." And that's the end of that chapter. I didn't like that chapter. It was there for a reason, and that's literally it. It didn't really add anything except that story beat. And that's a shame, because that's John's last chapter, too. This is the problem with the fact that John doesn't get the nice, like, closure of her storyline at the end of the story the way that all the other characters did. You know, Bruce gets, like, the whole chapter where he sits down with Alfred and talks about it. Selina's closure chapter is coming up. Barsad's is kind of stretched over his 2 chapters, conveying the events of the battle. And then John's happened like in the middle of the story and was complete and utter bullshit. It's ridiculous. She really got the short end of the stick in this story. It's sad. So we're moving on to the Selina chapter now. The alleyway was dark around them, the buildings rising up like they wanted to touch the sky. It was only midtown, but the shadows were dense here. He was silent like he always was when she'd seen him. He was silent like he always was. Like, I don't understand, because that has the implication that Batman just talks to other people but doesn't talk to Selina. Like, it's such a weird and convoluted way to say something very simple, that basically he's quiet, he's always quiet. Like, he's silent as ever, you know. But anyway. "Where are you taking me again?" she asked him. Not a word. She wouldn't expect any more, but she thought she might ask anyway. Once they reached the end, they were met by a wall of containers. The front of the one directly ahead of them slid open, revealing that bike of his he'd been roaring down the highway on. "Oh, you shouldn't have," she said with mock sweetness. She stepped right into the thing and hopped on. The controls blinked in front of her. The tunnel's blocked by debris, but the cannons give you enough firepower to make a path for people. She looked up. His voice sounded different. more growling, if that was even possible. She looked back down at the thing and moved her hands over the handles. To turn it on, you. She turned the clutch and the thing roared to life beneath her. I got it. He stepped out of the way as she rolled out of the container. It was smoother than she thought it would be. I want that back before you leave, he said to her. Leave, she said, and then realized he was talking about the clean slate again. Don't worry, I'll return it, she said with a smirk. He narrowed his eyes, but he didn't say a word. She started to move off when she saw him move to the wall and scramble up the side, his movements all jerky. She cringed involuntarily and roared out of the alley. So this is another part of Bruce's powers that I don't really get. Basically, what it means is, like, he kind of moves like a stop-motion character, and I don't understand why that's a thing, because I know it's like, oh, it makes him more creepy, but, like, don't you think a giant man, like, crawling up a wall in a black suit is creepy enough? He has claws and fangs. Like, I'm not entirely sure why I kept adding all these other little details to it. But anyway, she let herself relax and then get into it. It was exhilarating. The thing was fabulous. The cool air of night whipped through her hair as she sped down the street. Buildings whizzed by, all a blur of dark bricks and dim lights. She went to push it into a turn, but instead the wheels began to flip, facing her the way she wanted while keeping her upright. Damn, she thought, maybe she wouldn't give it back. The tunnel was closer to the Narrows than it was to where they'd been. She took the road that followed the fence, and it became more deserted as she went along. She was surprised that Bane didn't have any of his men out there, but they were probably all of town with him. She came to the tunnel and rolled to a stop. The entrance was completely blocked with crushed cars, most of them police cruisers, and a few others. She looked down at the bike. As good as it was, she wasn't sure the thing would be able to get through, but he told her it would, so it must. The sound of a distant explosion caught her ear. It sounded like it was starting so soon. She got back down and reached for the handles again. She could feel the triggers at the bases. She pushed them both. The wall of cars cleaved right in half, leaving the edges of the space blackened and her ears ringing. Now came the hard part. The path was clear in front of her. She could get the hell out of Dodge right now without looking back. She could actually start over. She wouldn't be Selena Kyle, master jewel thief anymore. This was it. If this would have happened 5 months ago, she wouldn't even have hesitated, but things had changed. The city hadn't been nice to her, but it hadn't been nice to anyone, really, especially since last November. Gotham had a penchant for getting attacked and taken over, but outside of the special cases, it wasn't any different than New York or any place else, and New York didn't have a Batman. She had a record, but that thing had been following her around since she was a teenager. The only reason she wanted to get away so badly before was because of Daggett and Stryver, and both of them were long gone now. It wasn't impossible to go from the bottom to the top. She didn't know how close she'd be getting to the top, but it wouldn't be impossible to get comfortable legitimately. Besides, she'd gotten in good with the commissioner and the deputy commissioner. Surely someone wouldn't be opposed to pulling a few strings should something come up. She put the bike in reverse and then turned it back towards uptown. Going didn't seem like the thing to do, at least not yet. She sure as hell wasn't going to change her name. Why would she ever want to be anybody but Selena Kyle? And that's the end of that chapter. See what I mean? Selena gets this nice chapter tying up the loose ends of her arc right there. Boom, done. And this is her last chapter. That's a nice note to end it on, because we finally come back to the whole thing of her, like, wanting to leave town, and we talk about it, and now it's over. Ta-da! And John didn't get that, but let's not harp on that. That chapter was all right. Like, it wasn't anything special. I think it is a nice ending to Selena's arc, so for what it is, it works. But there were a lot of little things that bothered me in that, but they were mostly little things that showed up in every single other chapter too, so I'm not gonna harp on it. So anyway, now we move to the first of Barsad's last 2 chapters. He felt like they were standing on a field of live mines. The police filled the street, waiting for Bane to make his move. From their place on the roof, he could see the steps of City Hall, and they were completely bare. "Where are they?" he asked her. Batman asked Selena to go open the tunnel, but the rest of them are all down there, Jen said, indicating the street below them. "Shouldn't we be down there?" he asked. She shook her head. "I can't do shit. I can't stop you, though," she said, turning to him. He looked down at the street again. The mercenaries were streaming from the front of City Hall, filling the other end of the street. He could see the tumblers coming too. The police were still there, unmoving. Thousands of men and women ready to fight for their city. This place had become his home over the last month or so, but he didn't know it like they did. He didn't love it like they did. "I can't help them," he told her. The 2 groups stared at each other in silence. "Disperse," a voice came from one of the tumblers. "Disperse or be fired on." The police stood their ground and then began to move forward. He saw the tumblers prepare to fire, but ducked instinctively as the Batman came down in his aircraft and fired at them. See, if Barsad could call it an aircraft, why couldn't John? But anyway, one of the tumblers erupted in smoke. That's when all hell broke loose. The two groups went rushing toward each other, meeting and erupting in shouts and yells and gunshots. The other tumbler sent a flurry of missiles at the aircraft, and he flew off through the skyscrapers. The street turned into chaos, the crowd overflowing into the connecting streets. He moved for the stairs. He didn't know what he could do for the rest of them, but at the least he could make sure his friends were okay. It was only slightly quieter inside the building, the sounds of battle echoing off the marble walls. Again, every building is made of marble in Gotham City, apparently. In Gotham City. There was another explosion outside, a louder one. He could even hear the aircraft as it flew over the street. The sounds became louder as they descended the steps. He came to a halt so suddenly at the bottom of the last flight that Jen careened right into his back. One of the mercenaries, one he remembered, was there. "Barsad?" he asked, eyes wide. He felt Jen tense behind him. "Forgive me," Barsad said as he disarmed him. He knocked him unconscious, took his gun, and stepped over him into the lobby. That's not supposed to be funny, but it is. Jesus Christ! They'd arrived just in time to see all the chandeliers that had hung from the ceiling begin falling to the ground, one after another, going absolutely to pieces as they did. Absolutely to pieces. The people down there didn't let that stop them, unless they were crushed by the larger ones. Oh my god. They moved as quickly as they could over the debris-filled floor when they spotted Rose taking cover behind one of the columns. Jen flew out from beside him and went for the arm of one of the large chandeliers, just missing a bullet as she returned. Jesus, that wasn't worth that. Barsad saw the man who did it and aimed for his side, but he flew into the air and crashed into the wall, sliding to the ground looking absolutely shattered. Is absolutely the only, adjective that I knew back then? Why? Just say he looked shattered. That gets the point across. Fuck, Rose muttered. He started to understand when he saw a girl go dashing towards the stairs, another mercenary at her back. I thought you two were supposed to be upstairs, she hissed through her teeth as she reloaded her gun. Barsad moved his head just as a bullet whizzed by him. Rose sent the man to the ground with a bullet to the foot. "We got bored," Jen said sarcastically. This feels like a really dangerous situation for them to just be having, dialogue right now. Shouldn't they be taking cover somewhere? Rose glared at her. "What happened to the chandeliers?" he asked her. "I don't fucking know." "Look, if you two aren't gonna stay up there, then you're gonna have to fight. Either that or get in the basement with Foley and Gordon." "What happened to them?" Jen asked. Foley took a bullet to the side. "They're trying to patch him up." Barsad looked down at the gun in his hands as shots rang out across the marble. You don't have time for this. He could go down there and wait it out, but just because he had a gun didn't mean he had to kill. He shook his head. "I'll stay. I'll fight." They turned at the sound of another explosion outside the door. The flaming hunk of a tumbler rolled down the street. A motorcycle pulled into a screeching turn outside, the wheels flipping sideways, and then raced back toward the main street. "Was that him?" he asked. "Selina!" Jen cried out. She grabbed him by the hand and pulled him towards the door. Bad idea. The battle was still raging, and a thin film of smoke hung over the street, illuminated by the few lights that had made it unscathed so far. The asphalt was stained with blood and scattered with bodies. Jen had started towards the crowd of people on the main street, but Barsad took hold of her arm. "What are you doing? She's out there. You only have a pipe." She frowned and started to respond, but lost the words as her eyes went wide when she saw something over his shoulder. His first instinct was to attack. "Don't!" she shouted as a hand grabbed hold of him. He was taken aback by the fact that he noticed how warm they were through the black gloves that covered them, and then by the long claws that tipped the fingers. He looked up to find the Batman staring back at him, his yellow-green eyes glowing brightly in his scowling mask. There we go. God. Okay. Mercenaries happened to notice him at the same time and came flying at them, their guns surprisingly missing. The Batman moved so fast he seemed a shadow in the dark. Barsad and Jen had a few of their own as well. In the end, Barsad ended up with the scar on his arm half reopened. Jen's hands were covered in blood from whoever was unlucky enough to have been fighting her. The pipe worked better than he thought it would. Why is Jen even here? I don't get that. If Jen can't actually, fight, she should not be anywhere near this battle. I understand maybe not wanting to leave her home alone, but, it'd be different if, say, her and Barsad were left back at the house and something like that. And then they were like, no, we should be up there. So they kind of went up there because they're both dumb kids. So it makes sense that they would do something silly, like show up to a battle when one of them literally can't fight and the other one's afraid of being noticed by everyone. I think that would make more sense. Secondly, the cut on Barsad's arm, he got that in one of the chapters that had been cut from the edited version. The thing is, though, that happened a month ago, so that cut should be closed by now. Unless it was so, like, if it was that deep, he would have needed stitches. Like, there's no way that that should have come open again a month later. That's weird. And again, I guess if it was like that, then he would have needed stitches, and I'm surprised they couldn't, like, dig up a doctor somewhere around there, but whatever. He looked up at a shout from across the street and saw John beckoning them towards another doorway. He went without hesitation. They flew through the door with Rose skidding in behind them before John slammed the door shut. They ended up in the basement of someplace, just an empty room with bare walls and a concrete floor. She hadn't bothered with lights. That's weird, because if it's a basement, there was no mention of stairs. Basements are underground. That's how basements work. So this can't be the basement. It would just be like a ground floor. Anyway. He was out there with us, Jen said. Barsad hadn't realized that the Batman had gone. I know, he probably ran off to go deal with someone, John told them. She looked absolutely harried and sounded winded. She was sporting a wound on her forearm that had been bandaged, the fabric stained with her blood. His eyes widened when he noticed a puncture mark. Oh, boy. What bit you? He asked. He looked down at her arm as he took it into his hands. The mark he could see was shallow, but it was the others he was worried about. A fucking wolf, man. On 4 legs? She gave him a look, but nodded. He breathed a sigh of relief. Are the others deeper? She shook her head. It still bled like hell, though. It wouldn't even turn her, he thought. Shit's gone absolutely insane out there, man. Bane came out of City Hall a while ago, and she waved her hand. Shit's gone insane, she repeated. Again, all of the cursing, it really just feels like I feel like I'm reading something written by like a 13-year-old who is writing curses for the first time, but like a very well written for a 13-year-old. And it's like, oh man, the shit and the fucking, and it's just like, stop. The only reason I keep pointing this out is because, and I know it sounds weird because I curse a lot during the show, but there's a difference between like the kind of curse words that you drop in real life and then what feels right when you're reading it in a book or like in a script. Like, I know nowadays I'm very judicious about where I put certain curse words because certain words just don't feel right popping up any old where. You kind of use them for emphasis. But anyway, Barsad looked up as something entered the room behind him. He couldn't hear it, but he felt the warmth, just like he had when he grabbed his arm. The Batman approached them in near silence. He briefly wondered if it was the same man in the suit. He moved differently now, and Barsad still could not get over the claws. It wasn't what he was expecting. Then again, he didn't know what he had been expecting. What's up? John asked him. You never told me why he can't see me. John looked at him now. Oh, we don't know, Barsad told him. He could feel you before, but you started fading. He thought you were dead. I've heard. I don't know about the others. It'd be safe to assume they can still see you, though. Their powers aren't like his. Batman gave him a short nod and then moved for the window he'd entered through. I love how he turns into the bat thing and now he's just climbing through the windows, just like a real bat. I need someone to go to City Hall when I find him. Miranda and Lucius are there. I'll go, Barsad said. By yourself? If I have to. Batman nodded again and climbed out through the window. I'll go with you, Jen told him. Take this, then. John pulled out her gun and handed it to her, along with the ammo. Don't kill anybody, she said sternly. You're not coming? John shook her head. He noticed that she was looking a bit pale. I'm going to stay here with her, Rose told them. Come on, Jen said, grabbing him by the arm. They pushed open the door and emerged back into the chaos. And that's the end of that chapter. That chapter was shorter than I remember, which is saying something, because it wasn't that short. This one was alright. I think it was definitely better than the John chapter. I don't know about the Selena chapter, but it wasn't terrible. I think what I find the most interesting about this is trying to track Barsad's character arc between this and then his next chapter. Because there are some interesting, very significant lines that come up like early on when they're on the roof and Jen's like, shouldn't you be down there? Because I can't do anything, but you can. And he's like, I can't help them. But then later when they meet up with Rose, Rose is like, well, you either need to fight or you need to get out of here. And he's like, no, I'll stay and I'll fight. So it's clearly like something is happening there. And I think that's what's most interesting. So now let's move to the first ever actual Batman POV chapter. What? We can talk about why this is a thing after this chapter's over. He traveled to City Hall by rooftop. He didn't have the time to try and take to the streets. People attacked him on sight. Were it anything else, he'd take them, but he wanted to end this now. It felt like electricity filled his veins. This had been going on for a while, and he wasn't even tired. He crawled over the bricks of the building, breaking the top just as a bullet pinged off the wall beside him. He hissed, pulled the wire from his belt, and pulled the man off his feet. He used his teeth to rip it and then wound it around the fire escape. What kind of wire is it that he can rip it with his teeth? Well, I guess he has stronger teeth now. Whatever. He kept on, thankful that he'd been the only one that was in the air. He took the gap between the two buildings at a run, landing on the fire escape of the next one. He bypassed its stairs, taking to the wall instead. He loved climbing the more he did it, and even in this moment he wouldn't pass it up. Besides, it moved him faster. That's got to be a reference back to Batman Begins when he jumped off the roof of the police department and landed, really badly on the fire escape of the building next door. That's too particular. The next roof was the same height, and he did a running jump again. He overshot, rolling all the way to his other side and coming to a stop at the edge. He snatched himself back as soon as. There was someone down there, but they weren't worried about him, chasing someone else down the alleyway. He jumped the gap and then whipped around at the sound of a crack. That same man he saw went tumbling down the alley and landed flat on the ground. Pin that, because we're going to see that moment again. The building was right in front of him, the hole he'd blasted into it clear as day. He stepped back and then jumped the gap, grabbing onto the ledge with his hands. The yells he heard told him that he was seen. He threw a smoke bomb down and scrambled into the hole before the cloud could clear. Why didn't he throw the smoke bomb first? If you don't want to be seen, then put the thing down so you can't be seen. Throw up the smoke screen before you jump onto the building instead of waiting till everyone sees you and then throwing it so you can disappear. But whatever. Even with the hole, the place was still dark, all wood supports. Anticipating grenades, he broke through them and crawled through the hole he made. He was upside down on the ceiling of the front hall. He flinched slightly at an explosion. The blast dully felt through the hole. He'd been right. He moved to the wall, then dropped to the floor. His cape fluttered down silently behind him. There were mercenaries near the doorway, but they hadn't noticed him, so he left them and moved silently into the next room. There was a lot going on in here. He heard fighting on the floors below and fighting in places adjacent, all mingling with the sounds of fighting outside the walls. He decided to take care of the people behind the door opposite him. He kicked it down, and the people turned on him immediately, allowing the others they'd been fighting to escape. He knocked the gun from the first person who came at him, broke his arm, then sent a kick to the next before the first dropped to the ground. The others came too, and he took them down in a flurry of punches and kicks that ended in broken legs and bruises and bleeding. He barreled through the next room as well, taking down everyone who hadn't ran, no exceptions. Only one gave him trouble, forcing him to resort to claws. Sure. Again, reading this is always kind of because I've written Speak of the Devil, and spending 23 episodes with a character who has an arc about learning to not hurt people as much because of the fact that his impact on them. These people don't always have the money to go to hospitals and get this stuff done and pay those bills. It's just really bizarre to see that and the type of hero that Daredevil is in Speak of the Devil, and then come back to Batman and see him just wantonly breaking people's limbs left and right, and the story portraying this is completely okay. If anything, it does show how I've changed as a person, what kind of stuff I was okay with back then. But moving on. The hall behind that was empty. He didn't like it one bit. He knew they said that Bane couldn't see him, couldn't feel him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for him somewhere. The kid had said there were others. Someone must have seen him coming. It was impossible that they hadn't. He was being paranoid, but this time he felt fully justified, especially after what happened in the sewers. He creeped along the hallway, absolutely silent. He felt like he was waiting for something, someone to appear, something to happen, something. He made it all the way to the end of the hall without incident, but he didn't know what lay beyond the door. He turned the knob slowly, pushed it open only a bit, and was met by an empty room. The only other door in the room was slightly ajar. He didn't like that either. He slipped in and climbed up the wall, then to the ceiling. It was when he reached the other side that he felt it. The warmth permeated the walls as if they were standing right next to each other, completely and utterly justified, he thought. Then he backtracked. It could be anyone. There were probably over 1 million other vampires in this city, and close to 1,000 in Bane's ranks alone. It might not be the man himself at all. Whoever it was, he knew they could feel him as well. He couldn't really hide anymore, but that wasn't any reason to go barreling in. He'd stupidly done that before. He was much stronger now than he'd been then, than he'd ever been, but now was not the time for chances. Now was not a good time to forget himself. The Batman isn't a tank, he thought. I'm a shadow. He's here, someone said from the other room. He could tell the other room was big by the way the voice echoed. It had stone floors, at the least. He doubted the walls were made of the same thing. The voice didn't move that way. So that's a nice little touch. I think showing how Bruce's senses have enhanced by having him listening in and being able to tell like what materials are used in the other room because of how the voices echo. It actually reminds me of a moment that I think I stole from this for Lego Story. Did I ever explain that Lego Story was a Marvel fanfic? But Natasha, as in the Black Widow Natasha, her and Clint and Jean Grey get stuck in the sewers at one point, and Natasha just kind of stands there and listens to the sounds down there and then decides, like, the moving water is this way and this is how we get out. So it's like a similar-ish thing. I feel like there might be another story where something like this happens, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, I know, someone else said. Neither of them were Bane. Didn't mean he wasn't there, though. Footsteps followed, coming in his direction. He moved near the door, near leaving the ceiling, and then took his cape in his teeth so it wouldn't hang. Okay, this is weird, because there is literally a function from The Dark Knight in the literal movies where Batman sort of like made it so that his cape turns into like a backpack sort of looking thing when he needs it to not be like flying around all over the place. This is literally in the movie, and I don't understand why I didn't carry that over here instead of having him walking around carrying his cape like he's a dog with a blanket. Like, but anyway, one of them entered, gun poised to fire. He stopped, apparently shocked to find an empty room. Batman gave him a dart to the neck for his trouble and then crawled through the doorway into the other room. How'd he do that? What? Anyway, it'd been just as he expected. Limestone floors and painted plaster walls, big and circular shaped. The ceiling bore a shallow dome and columns lined the walls. He moved quickly and perched on the capital of the nearest one. Somehow, the other person in the room had turned just as he disappeared from the doorway. Another dart to the neck took care of him. He took his cape in his mouth again and moved to the center of the ceiling. So I guess this is where the whole, like, him not having to dig into actual things comes in handy, so he can climb up on, like, glass ceilings and just kind of hang there. That's cool, I guess. It still feels wholly unnecessary. But anyway, that was when he finally entered. Bane came through a door in the back of the room, bearing cuts and bruises and splattered in blood that Batman doubted had belonged to him. He shook his head at the mercenary lying unconscious on the floor. Mood. He could tell he was inspecting the room around him, but unlike the other two, he had the good sense to look up. Oh my god. I'm sorry, I don't know why that's so funny. Oh man. Batman let out a hiss and he actually saw Bane's story. I don't know why this is funny. To be honest, if we're being completely H, I have to say that the image of Batman, imagine you walk into this giant room and you're like, you see two guys laying down, you know what happened to them, but you can't see who did it even though you know who did it. And then you look up and there's a giant man hanging from the ceiling and he turns and then he fucking hisses at you and he has fangs. Is that not alarming? Even if you are like a vampire yourself? That's still pretty fucking, like, scary. I feel like this scene actually, due to the fact that it's told from Batman's POV, you kind of lose the effect of how alarming that is. I feel like if this had been in an actual film, it would have come across as a lot creepier, but anyway. He let his cape go and dropped to the ground. They were face to face again when he rose, Bane looking down at him from his impressive height. He couldn't read the expression on his face to save his life, and he didn't waste time trying. Bane was rushing at him, an absolute fire in his eyes. So he's angry. I find it funny that he was on the ceiling and he did all of that, and then he didn't actually jump on Bane or anything like that. That's interesting. What was the point? He decided to play the defensive now. He dove and rolled out of the way, coming to his knees to block the kick that was aimed for his head. Trading blows went differently this time. Batman was the one leaning on method this time, becoming the terrible wraith he'd been trained to be, and more. Bane came at him ruthlessly, like a monster who'd been woken from a mythic sleep, but even then he could tell he hadn't completely forgone his training. Did I just compare him to Cthulhu? Anyway, it was a fleeting thought, one of many that made him tear at the tubes on the mask. He didn't know what it would do, but why the hell not, he thought. Why the hell not? If we're being completely H, in this story, Batman never ever learns anything about the mask because he wasn't, like, locked up in the pit with the guy who made the mask or knew what the mask did and knew about Bane's back injury. So it makes sense that he kind of does it on a whim instead of being like, oh, maybe I should break that. I know what it does. I mean, you could guess that it does something important, but I think this story does sort of like get around like why he never thought to try that before, because he didn't really like understand it. Anyway, Bane kept at him after that, but he noticed that he started to lose step. He actually managed to get away from him once, and Bane's eyes went wide as he scrambled up the wall. "I broke you," Bane said. "How have you returned?" He could hear the exasperation hiding in his voice. "You might have overlooked a few things," Batman growled back. Bane shook his head like he was in disbelief. "No, I've worked too hard to let one man stop me." He didn't even try to fight back the hiss that escaped his mouth. "And I haven't?" He leapt off the wall and tackled Bane to the ground, half surprised he even went down. He could feel Bane shaking beneath him. That was odd. Oh, God. "I want you gone by morning," Batman told him. He should have gotten to his feet sooner, because he wouldn't have felt the convulsions get worse. That warmth brought something out of him, and that brought back that unease in his stomach. He kneeled back down and reconnected the tubes. "If you ever set foot on this island and try to pull a stunt like this again, I won't be this kind," he snarled. He turned and left without looking back. And that's the end of that chapter. So the one thing about some of the missing Bruce chapters, and then this explanation of like the supposed attraction between vampires and werebats, is that that moment with Bane comes across as a little bit weird in this version, but that's basically what happened there. Here's my thing though, with Bane, he has that thing because of his back. So why did he go into convulsions? Because I don't know anything about medical history, but anyway, or medicine, let's say. Anyway, end of the chapter. That chapter was all right. It wasn't bad. It wasn't good, but it wasn't bad. My biggest issue is that I found a lot of the action really confusing at points, and it might be because like my brain is just kind of like started to go on autopilot at points, but I think this chapter could have benefited by being just more concise and getting the action across in better ways. Outside of that, though, I think for like our first inaugural actual Batman chapter, it's very fitting. Finally getting into Bruce's head while he's in the suit. You can see why all of these thoughts before, where he's like, well, I don't want to stop being Batman because this, that, and the other. And you can see here where that all comes from. And clearly this is something that he actually likes doing and stuff. It all comes together. It's a nice place to end his story as well. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here. I just wanted to add one more comment, which is that this whole thing with the attraction between werebats and vampires comes off as really strange to me, because it's constantly being used to explain things that can easily be explained by Bruce's character. If you guys remember in the last episode, which I know was a while ago since I posted this one, but in that episode, it was mentioned by Bruce, I think, after Fox explained everything to him, that, oh, that's why I was so excited to see Alfred, because Alfred's a vampire and I'm a werebat now. But it's Alfred. So it's like, why did that need an additional explanation? That doesn't really make sense. Here, when he decides to go back and put Bane's mask back together, that can totally just be explained by Bruce's character and not wanting Bane to die, because that's not what he's about. But instead, it's chalked up to the attraction. Like, it just seems really unnecessary and a reason to explain things that don't really need additional explanation. And I know it was there to set up some stuff in the future, but without that future stuff, it still needs to make sense as it is right now. And right now, it just seems unnecessary. So now we move back to the last Barsad chapter, and this is the last proper chapter of this story. Just a note, after this, there were supposed to be some denouement chapters. And in the original story, there was one, but that got cut because it was kind of goofy. So there is no more denouement. After this, we cut straight to the epilogue. But yeah, so last chapter. There was a mercenary on them as soon as they stepped out of the doors. Jen hit him over the head with the butt of her gun for his trouble. Does she even know how to use a gun? Anyway, they had their hands full when two more showed up. "We're not going to be able to get there from out here," he told her once they'd finally been dealt with. "There are too many people." "We can take a back way," she said, jerking her head towards the alleyway behind the building they just left. "They're all connected, pretty much. Lead the way." She grabbed his arm and pulled him into the alley before anyone could notice them. The buildings barely muffled any of the sounds of the streets, gunshots bouncing heavy off the concrete and asphalt and brick. They had to go through the alleys that opened to the street. They had to through the alleys that opened to the street in fear that someone might see them and decide to attack. It worked. Dash? There's just a word missing, but I'm not sure which word, like which action word it's supposed to be. But apparently it works sometimes, whatever they did. So I'm assuming it's like run or dash or something like that. There was one, a huge man that blocked their path to the next alley. Barsad didn't remember him, but the man seemed to, and he was angry about it. He pulled out a knife and they ran perpendicular, diving into a different alley and dashing behind a dumpster. "We don't stand a chance against this guy," Jen muttered as she loaded her gun. "We can't kill him," Barsad said. "Joanna said not to kill anybody." "He's gonna kill us. What do you want to do?" He started to answer when the dumpster slid, knocking them both to the ground. He rolled over to see the man coming towards them, fire in his eyes. "You betrayed us, little brother," he said, stomping toward them. "I can't let that pass." Barsad scrambled to his feet, his breathing heavy. His gun was weighing heavy in his hands. He didn't have time to think about the consequences anymore. He cocked the gun and raised it. There was a flash of red light as the knife flew from the man's hands. Oh, God. He looked just as shocked as they did. The man looked up at someone behind them, his rage growing, but in another spark of red his eyes rolled back into his head and he fell to the ground. Barsad whipped around to find that girl he'd seen before, breathing just as heavily as he was. Thank you," he said to her. "No problem," she said back. She squinted at him. "Have we met before?" He remembered her as soon as she said it, the secretary from Wayne Tower. Her heavy bangs should have been unmistakable. "Maybe," he said in a half-lie. She nodded and then went to help Jen up. He was actually glad she didn't remember. She was heavily armed. She was heavily armed. So, did you notice, I told you to pin that moment during the Batman chapter? The action between the two chapters is very different. Because Batman, when he's running across the roof, he stops and then he looks down and he sees a guy stumble backwards like into a wall or something like that and then go unconscious. Here, the guy literally just falls over after having his gun knocked out of his hand. So I don't know why I didn't decide to, scroll up a little bit and make sure the things lined up, but it's also weird that Batman wouldn't have seen Jen and Barsad during this if they're apparently here. But anyway. "Is he dead?" Jen asked. "Nah," the girl said, "just unconscious." Barsad could see now that he was still breathing, though shallowly. She glanced over her shoulder. "Let's get out of here before someone gets him up." They made their way back to the direction they were supposed to be headed, thankfully uninterrupted. "My name's Jessica, by the way," she told them. "I'm Jen. This is Barsad, and we're headed for City Hall." She smiled. "Great. I was just headed the same way." "Well, why?" Barsad asked as they creeped along another passage. "My boss is in there. I figured I should do something about that." "Small world," Jen said. The alleyways went on like a maze, one Barsad had only gotten a taste of before. City Hall seemed farther than he thought when they were on the roof. Then again, he thought they must have taken the long way around. Jessica seemed to know it better than either of them once they'd gotten to a certain point. "Almost there," Jessica told them. He could actually see it now, a gaping hole in the dome that topped it. He didn't know whether the Batman was there yet. There was an alley that went in front of them, but Jessica led them perpendicular and then down another. "It's kind of roundabout," Jen said. "I don't want to take any chances," Jessica told them. "The farther away from the street, the better." Barsad couldn't help but agree. She led them along the alley and then another until they reached the building itself. Even back there, the white walls were stained with black. There was a mercenary nearby, but Barsad took care of him as quickly and quietly as possible. Jen tried the door, but it was locked tight. She cursed under her breath and then turned to Jessica. "Should we find another door? Is that a wand?" The door burst open in front of them. "All right, then." And so, wizards are a thing in this. To be honest, at this point, are we surprised? Audience, are we really surprised? Like, we've got vampires and we've got literal Batmen and werewolves and shit, and like, to be honest, this is the least surprising thing that's happened so far. The room in front of them was dark and they approached with caution. "It's empty," he told them. From the way they were moving, he could tell even Jessica couldn't see how he could. They both relaxed, but only a bit. Once they reached the opposite wall, he gingerly opened the door. They entered a hall obscured with shadows, the only light coming from a streetlight that came through the window. I keep forgetting that this takes place at night. Large panes of glass lined the ceiling, shielding a mural that ran the length of the entire hall. He was surprised it had made it unscathed, as the rest of the hall was in ruins. Everything that lined the walls was now on the floor or in pieces or both. Broken ceramics and wood crunched underfoot as they moved through. "It's too quiet," Barsad said. "This place should be crawling." There was a bang as soon as he said it, but it came from a distance. He wasn't sure, but he guessed the Batman had caused it. Oh, that was that grenade I think someone threw in the roof after Bruce when he climbed into the building. "I'm not complaining," Jessica said. "Jessica?" Someone called from the door. "Miss Tate?" Jessica said, running to it. "How did you get up here?" Jen tried the door. "It's locked." "From both sides," Fox said. Jen gave the thing a look. Barsad pulled her back. He knew Jessica would obliterate the thing. Stand back, Jessica told the others. The whole knob went flying off in a small blast. They both stumbled out, looking disheveled and relieved. What happened? Jessica asked. Fox simply answered, empty-handed. She nodded. I don't know what happened, Tate said. There were people everywhere before. And they just left? Jen asked. Someone locked us in there, and then I heard something explode, and then it went quiet. They all looked confused, but Barsad's eyes widened. They're still here, he told them. Just then, one of the doors burst open, mercenaries flooding the hall behind them. They ran for the opposite door. Gunshots rang out over marble, and then the ceiling began to fall. They fell to the ground, covering their heads to shield from the glass raining down on them. Barsad looked up to see that his arm was bleeding again. How does glass fall in such a way that it cuts the thing? Whatever. Voices echoed around the hall. They were mercenaries yelling at each other. Someone wasn't supposed to do that, he thought. He pulled himself up and urged the others up as well. They had to get out while they weren't paying enough attention. There was more yelling when they finally noticed them going through the door. After climbing a flight of stairs, they emerged at another hall, one with vaulted ceilings that stared straight up into the sky. Barsad didn't take the time to admire it. He and the others ran straight for the other end. Jessica skidded to a halt at the door. What is it? He said to her. She just looks from the ceiling to the mercenaries. You wouldn't, he said. The jet of blinding blue light that went into the roof said that she would. The entire thing came crashing down. It was like a waterfall starting at the end they were on and moving all the way to the other side. The supports came down too, some of them disintegrating to pieces as they fell to the ground. Jessica pulled him through the doorway as the mercenaries went down. She slammed the door shut behind them. The ceiling? Fox asked. She nodded. Tate shook her head in disbelief, and Jen looked at her like she was crazy. You're too good at that. They didn't send me to magic school for nothing, she said, shaking her wand. Come on, let's get out of here before someone gets up. They continued on, trying to circle back to the building's rear and get out unnoticed. Barsad was winded from the running and the blood loss, but it only made him fight harder. He hit a mercenary over the head so hard the man bled. Oh, yeah, great job. There was another, and Barsad was ready to deal with him, too, when the man stopped abruptly. His eyes widened, and he ran off. Oh, what the hell was that? Jen asked. He shrugged. I'm not complaining, Jessica repeated. I'm not complaining. Is that her catchphrase? Barsad thought for a moment. Was he so scared of a 17-year-old boy? It didn't make sense, until it did. Bane had given his people commands mentally before. He was called off, he told them. Why? Jen asked. As if in answer, a roar sounded from outside. It was low, but it was screeching. It felt like it was vibrating the room, though it had to travel through stone and glass to reach them. There was no mistaking. It was the same one he'd heard that morning. I guess that's why we didn't describe it, so we could get it here. I don't know. Once it went quiet, it was followed by a chorus of howls. It's over, he said. They breathed a sigh of relief that had been building for 5 months. And that is the end of that chapter. I mean, this ties up the battle pretty nicely, considering that apparently we only have a few viewpoints that we could have used for it. I do like the way that I just kind of systematically took a bunch of other characters out of the story so that Barsad could be the only person who could do this. But I think it does sort of tie up his arc pretty nicely. It didn't touch on it as well as I thought it would. But the whole point of Barsad's arc is that he goes from being reluctant to help the others in a way that actually puts him in conflict with his dad physically to being super willing to do all this stuff. I guess maybe his other chapter kind of covered the entire breadth of it. Because, like, as I said, he starts out being like, I can't help them, and then he's like, no, I will fight. And then by the end of the chapter, he's volunteering to go find Miranda and Fox because he's like, well, these people need help. This chapter does show that he is willing to finally, like, really fight the people that he had once called, like, brother and go against them for what he thinks is right. So I think it's a, I guess, somewhat solid end for his chapter. It covers the battle as well as it can. The action in this one, it's not as confusing as some of the stuff in the Batman chapter. There's a lot of running around, and I feel like the depiction of, like, alleys and stuff is a little bit off, but I can kind of fly past that. It's fine. It's fine. I think it works for what it is. To be honest, the inclusion of Jessica, I used to think it was kind of like, oh my god, the wizards. But to be honest, I've become so used to this story now that her showing up and, like, stipendoing people really isn't that weird anymore. Not to mention that she really came in handy. Like, if there's one thing I wasn't expecting, it was the fact that the secretary who literally showed up in one scene in Batman Begins would come back and play a major role in the battle at the end of The Dark Knight Rises, but I guess it's all about lifting the veil off of things. Also, did you catch that Fox was also a wizard? What is he, like Gotham's Dumbledore? But anyway, like I said, it's fine. So now we move to the epilogue. Oh, this episode's gonna be long. The night had gone cold around him. The breeze that blew past him carried a significant chill. That's what you just said. Anyway, he pulled his cape around himself out of habit. The suit was warm enough on its own. It was still beautiful, though. The sky was absolutely clear. The forest waved in the dark below him, the changing leaves rustling on their heavy boughs. Quite a few of the flowers were still there, little red splashes in the blue night. It was darker than it was late. He came home very early that night. When he went out, he usually returned around midnight, but it was only 8. Busy days meant quiet nights, however, and it had been a busy day. He hadn't even taken off the suit before he came back out of the cave. He wasn't too tired anyway, and he wanted to see the moon. Feeling was always one thing, but seeing was always another. He'd felt his entire body relax as soon as he set eyes on it. He actually started to feel himself doze a few times, but made a mental note not to let himself fall asleep outside again. He'd gone a year and a half without incident, and he didn't want to break that streak. Weird Avengers reference there. I wonder why that was a thing. Also, now we get an establishment. It's been a year and a half since the end of the other story. So it is now, the other story ended in May of 2013. So it is now November of 2014. The fuck? That's kind of nuts. Master Wayne, he heard Alfred call from below. He shook off a vine that had crawled its way around his boot and moved to the edge of the cliff. There's someone here to see you. At this time of night? Is it Tony? Surprisingly, no. He climbed down and followed Alfred back into the cave. I didn't know who this man was, but he was wearing sunglasses at night, so I figured it must be important. I don't know if today is a good day, he said, indicating his claws. He's one of us, or if that makes you feel any better. It didn't, but he didn't say so. He changed out of the suit and then headed upstairs. Remember when I told you to pin the vines? That's because these vines are Devil's Snare from Harry Potter. So because Devil's Snare doesn't like heat and light, they move, which is weird for a plant, but apparently they crawl around to get away from heat and light. As you see in the first book, I think this is in the first movie too. No, it's not in the movie anymore, but in the book, when the kids are going to find the Sorcerer's Stone and they're going through all the different like things that the teachers put up to defend it from intruders, Hermione realizes like, oh, this is Devil's Snare, we need light, and then she is able to use a spell to simulate sunlight and get the plants to let them go and stuff. So basically, that's what this is depicting. The plants crawl away from sunlight, but when it's nighttime, they're outside on the face of the cliff that the cave is in. That was literally multiple references just to say, haha, you know this takes place in the same world as Harry Potter. As if we didn't have enough of those. I also love that because it's so late at night, Bruce is just like, someone's here, it's gotta be Tony, right? And it's like, no. Also, wouldn't Tony call? Anyway, the house was absolutely silent as he exited the study. Very few of the lights were on. They tended to keep it dark on these nights. He actually wanted to go to bed now, and with his reputation, he very well could have left whoever was at the door. But he decided not to. He didn't feel like being rude tonight. I kind of love that. In the front hall, he was met by a man, short and pink-skinned, with very short brown hair. The aforementioned sunglasses were in the front pocket of his suit now, leaving his gray-blue eyes visible. Pink-skinned is a really weird way to describe anyone, but anyway. Mr. Wayne, he started as he shook Bruce's hand. I'm Agent Phil Coulson with the Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division. He didn't even try to pretend that he was surprised by the clause. It's a bit late, he said. It's been a busy day, Bruce agreed, but he didn't show it. Why are you... Oh, okay, I got confused there. Because it's a pronoun game, I could have literally just said it's a bit late, Bruce said. I don't know why I didn't do that. It's a bit late, he said. It's been a busy day. Bruce agreed, but he didn't show it. Why are you here exactly? Phil pulled a manila envelope out of his jacket. I don't mean to alarm you, but we've been considering the Batman for the Avengers Initiative, and why would that have anything to do with me? We've kept an eye on you ever since that incident at the fundraiser you had for Harvey Dent back in 2008. Nothing too close, he said, obviously noticing the look on Bruce's face, but close enough. You've done some impressive things, Mr. Wayne. Always the damn fundraiser, he thought. Thank you, I guess, he said, taking the folder. It was filled with papers, with their seal printed on them, all very text-heavy. What exactly is the Avengers Initiative? S.H.I.E.L.D. is interested in creating a response team, if the need should ever arise for one, that can handle the fights that the military might not be able to. Bruce tilted his head. We've had a few visitors that were quite a handful. I don't know, Bruce said, flipping through the papers. I have a few visitors I have to worry about myself. He looked up and out at the city through the windows. I don't really feel comfortable stepping out of here until I know they aren't coming back. Agent Coulson nodded. We thought you might say that. In any case, the offer's open for when that time comes. Bruce nodded as well. Coulson saw himself out. And that's the end of that. This prologue is fine. I think this might be the best thing we've read so far. I'm not just saying that because Coulson's there. But for what it is, it actually works because it explains why in, I guess, a year or whatever. Because the time frame of how these stories happens is completely different than I thought. I remember talking about this before. But anyway, point being that this prologue basically existed to show that, yes, Batman could be an Avenger, but Batman was not going to be in the Avengers because of the reasons he said here. And for what it is, it's fine. Coulson and them totally coming up and being like, hey, we considered you for the Avengers Initiative. Yes, we know that you're Batman. Why are you worried about it? Anyway, it totally makes sense. And it was a running theme throughout a lot of these stories. S.H.I.E.L.D. always got in on the superhero stories. In a later version of Spider-Man, which was based off The Amazing Spider-Man, part of the reason why Spider-Man didn't show up in the Avengers is because S.H.I.E.L.D. actually couldn't figure out what his secret identity was. So the fact that they knew this, it makes sense that they would then approach Bruce and be like, hey, we want you to be an Avenger. Especially since he is really pretty much the only DC superhero, so it's not like he was going to make the Justice League or anything like that. It was basically him and a bunch of MCU Marvel characters, so throw him in the Avengers. So yeah, that chapter was fine. That was fine. So, unlike some of the other stories that I've read, I am going to avoid giving an overall assessment of The Dark Knight Rises as a whole, because the thing is, The Dark Knight Rises isn't a whole. So right now, I will be giving my final assessments on the unedited part of the story, which is that I don't like it. It's hard because this part of the story isn't complete anymore, and it doesn't link up well with the edited parts. So you can't be like, well, given what I know about this, that, and the other. It's hard to judge when you only have part of the story. But from what we've read, the quality of this section of the story ranges between okay and just like not that good at all. And part of that is due to the fact that this was maybe the second at best draft, probably the first. So there isn't a lot of edits and stuff, and aren't a lot of corrections. So you get a lot of things like that very first John chapter we read in the unedited versions that was just like complete trash and literally was just me trying to get that event on the page, and I didn't get a chance to actually go in and make it like worth something. But then on the other hand, you have some of these other chapters actually are okay. Not just the epilogue. There are some other ones that I read and I was like, oh, that's not bad. But my overall feeling about most of them has been pretty because the writing style is very like, it's just convoluted, it's overwrought, it's overwritten. I think that's the problem with this story. It's overwritten, so everything goes super slowly. The characters talk too much when they have conversations with each other. There's a lot of like random shit. The fucking fucks are just peppered throughout the story with no real thought given to how it makes the characters sound. There are a lot of weird like twists and turns. I don't really understand what I was going for with the original version of the story, but at the same time I do. So we need to kind of talk about that, because the point of The Dark Knight Rises, the way it was originally written and why it was like this, is because, I think I explained this before, this was supposed to function as the entry point into the mainstream universe as it existed in 2013. It was supposed to be you would read the entire Batman series first, and then from there, you would go in and then go on and read other stories that had more magic in them. So it makes sense that the story is written in a way where over time, like Batman Begins was supposed to be completely mundane. There's only like the tiniest hints that weird things are happening. The Dark Knight doesn't even have that. And then you get to The Dark Knight Rises, but there are weird little moments, and then they start to build up until you get to that reveal in that John chapter after the attack at the abandoned bank. However, and this is something that I've been thinking about, and I've really wanted to do this episode and finish this so I could talk about this. What I don't get is why I chose this story to do it. Because due to the fact that this story is then supposed to like suddenly introduce all of this new stuff to you. And again, with Bruce becoming literally like halfway through the story, becoming a werebat and him figuring it out, it makes sense. I can see why I made that choice, but why Batman? I don't get why I chose this story to do it with and not Harry Potter. Because the thing is, this story, due to the way it's written, it changes genre as you go through it. It starts out as like a more straightforward, like crime thriller sort of thing. But then as it goes forward, it starts to feel less and less like that and more like you're reading a fantasy story, which could be fine, but the tone changes as well. We talked about this a lot when we started reading the unedited chapters, and we got to specifically the reveal chapter from John's POV, and how there's a lot more like things like Jen kicking Barsad and him not being able to start immediately because of that or whatever. Or the little joke of like John being like, we have to have some way of dealing with this. How do you deal with this? The tone of the story changes completely between the two versions, and that's only exaggerated by the fact that up to that point the story had been edited to be even more in that crime thriller avenue. So it makes it seem like you are suddenly reading a different story. Like, as I was reading it, I was like, you know why this feels off? It feels like I'm reading Profs. And yeah, that might feel like a weird thing to say because Profs is also based off of a dark source material that's more like, it's not mundane because A Song of Ice and Fire is literally a fantasy story, but the source material itself, it has a slightly like darker-ish tone and it's more gritty and all this other stuff. But Profs feels the way it feels consistently throughout. And this is like Profs 2.0, I think we should say. This suddenly turns into that. And that's what leads to the weird discrepancy and why it feels like you're reading a different story. And that's why, again, I question why I decided to do it with Batman, where I would have to twist and turn a story that is already one way into something else and not Harry Potter, that literally is about the same thing, but it happens a lot earlier on in the story, but it's literally about that. And also, technically, it happened before this. So it's just kind of weird that I was like, okay, so people have to come in this way, but not that way when they're both the same thing. Because then if I'd done that, then Batman could have just existed as like the darker, more still crime thriller, but now magic happens that it was supposed to be. Or that it should have been, you know? It's strange. I don't really understand the choice to choose this story to do that with and not the story that's literally about that already. It's just weird. So yeah, like I said, overall assessment of this part of the story is that I'm not enamored with it at all. I feel like because this is my 5th time reading it for like a fanfic reread related like thing. It was originally the live tweets, but now, or this is my fourth time doing it, excuse me. And I feel like the second time I did this, I went through it and found out all of the cool things that I did back in the day that made me appreciate it. So now when I read through it again, I'm just kind of like, all right, show me something. And it can't, because there's nothing to be shown. I appreciate the work. You can tell that I worked really hard on this story though. I was about to say like the character arcs in this, with the exception of John, poor John, who kind of got thrown by the wayside halfway through the story as if that was okay, while everyone else had their arcs continue throughout the occupation and stuff. The other characters' character arcs were pretty well built, and then like they had all of their like significant points. They worked fine, even given the switch between the two things. I still think you could get the gist of where each one was supposed to go throughout. Now, the subject of those character arcs was suspect sometimes. Selina's arc in particular was kind of like, why do we have to frame it this way? The constant, like, point that kept coming up in the story that's like, hashtag not all rich people, that shouldn't have been the point of what was going on. So I'd say the one that was most well done was Bruce's, which makes sense because his arc extended through multiple stories. And also on top of the fact, his arc was the only one that didn't really have too much that was suspect. The only real issue was his reasons for wanting to stay being Batman were starting to come across as a little bit selfish, but I feel like I didn't intend that back in the day. I think I just didn't realize the implications of what I was writing, so Hey. And while Selena and Barsad's arcs are both well written, I think Barsad's more so because his doesn't really center completely around the not all rich people sort of thing, but is more about realizing that he disagrees with his dad and coming to terms with that. And I think that's a really good coming of age story. Selena's arc, as well put together as it was, the subject matter was just like that really put a damper on what I was trying to do there and have her realize, like, realizing the complexity of a character like Bane or a character like Bruce. That makes more sense, but framing it by also having her reassess the way she thinks about the rich people of Gotham as if like, oh, well, they can't all be bad and all this other, just like that completely kind of throws it for a loop. And then that leads to also another problem, which I had the last time I read the story, which was that like this story brought up a lot of issues, but it didn't deal with all of them. And I feel like it's because at the time I didn't realize half of this stuff was actual issues. So you could see me actually taking certain like things to task, like sexism. In the edited version, racism also came up. I don't know if that was in the unedited versions, but it may or may not have been. The characters who were colored in the edited version were colored in the unedited ones, so possibly. But the specific line that came up in Selena's chapter when she was released from jail about, like, are you saying that the Den Act hasn't brought up a bunch of racial profiling against people? And Selena's like, do I look like a white person? That line was not originally in that chapter. So that part wasn't there. But I think the general gist of racism is bad and we need to stop it was sort of throughout the story. So you could see me dealing with those, though, in a very surface level way. The stuff dealing with sexism and Selena's stuff really falls flat because it focuses a lot on Bruce, a person who literally cannot enact sexism against Selena because he cannot oppress her due to her gender. Like, that falls flat. But in John's chapters, in the edited stuff, that stuff holds up super well, and there isn't any of it in the unedited stuff, which is unfortunate. But there are a lot of other issues that me reading it now, I realize going through this. Like, everyone mentions the fact that the Dent Act is bad because it threw a bunch of people in jail without parole, but no one ever mentions the fact, like, that the Dent Act even happened and how that's problematic. And like, yes, the whole thing about the lie, but no one ever mentions that like the Dent Act, a law like that even got passed. And then that was okay. Like, sure, it's bad that Gordon lied and then he used it to push the Dent Act through, or they used it to push the Dent Act. But no one ever stops to think about the fact that the Dent Act itself is bad. And someone should have been like, whoa, maybe we shouldn't put people in jail without parole. Like, that doesn't become an issue until they find out that Gordon lied about what happened with Harvey Dent. Like, that's really bad. And then there are other things with, like, Bruce not wanting to give over technology to the police, but never really explaining very deeply why he doesn't want to do that outside of one man's tool is another man's weapon. But we never explore the implications of what that means. Like, there are a lot of things with, like, the law enforcement and the justice system in this story that are just not explained at all outside of a few, like, token mentions of, oh, this thing with the Dent Act happened. And, like, again, the racial profiling that happened because of the Dent Act, but no one ever talks about the fact that it got passed in the first place. Like, there are a bunch of other social issues that also come up throughout this, but the story never touches on them because I don't think I realized they were problems. Going back, though, now I see these things very clearly. And it dawns on me that, like, sometimes I feel like I shouldn't have been writing this story at this time. Like, I don't feel like I was at a point in my development of my social mores that I really could handle the kind of stuff that I was kind of putting this story on because of the changes I made, too. I don't know. It's just like, yeah, this story is kind of a mess. But hey, I did enjoy parts of the first half. I will say that. The edited chapters, some of them were actually pretty alright, especially for the time they were written. And you get what you can get, you know. It was better than Batman Begins, I'll give it that. So, we are done this long-ass episode and this long-ass reread. I think this might be the longest reread that we're gonna do. I'm pretty sure this is the longest fic that we're gonna read. So, congratulations, you've made it through. Next episode, we are going to, it's going to be a one-episode affair where we're going to read through some drafts of Children of the Night, which is another Batman AU. Children of the Night became something much bigger, but we'll talk about that more when we get there. But I basically only have drafts from a few stories that happen in that, and this is one of them, and it only covers like one episode, so. But we'll talk about that when we get to it, because I don't want to spend any more time in this episode than we all need to. So, if you like this episode, if you like this series, like this video on the YouTube and subscribe. You can listen to the other fanfics that I've reread, depending on when you're listening to this, and possibly watch other videos, because again, I don't know what's going to be on my channel at that time. And I will see you next episode. Bye!